going out a little bit to the west, Wellesley and the others, Brandeis and so on. But how do we think about bringing to the world the many intellectual riches that are here, the voices that can help them to think through many of the public issues? And that was the genesis. That was the origins of the Boston Global Forum. But in thinking about it and in truly making it global, we don't want it simply to be about Boston voices. We want it to be about the globe's voices. So it's going to originate from here. It's going to expand from here. This is our home, and it was the natural place to start making it happen. But we truly intend to make it a place where people around the world can come and listen to discussions of important issues, find out about what governments are doing about those issues, what people can do to make good things happen in their world. So that's kind of how it started, and that's kind of our general vision of what Boston Global Forum can be.
So given that we aim to look for practical solutions to real world issues, and your extensive background and expertise in journalism and politics, how do you see the field of journalism having an impact and contributing to the issue that we're working towards solving this year of minimal standards for worker safety?
Well, I think sadly, I think that particular issue exposes part of the problem of journalism. So when do workers end up on the front page of our newspapers or at the top of our newscasts? Almost always it takes a disaster for them to be at the top of the news. That was certainly the case with the tragedy around a plaza in Bangladesh. Now, that's important that those events and developments get covered because it brings them to our attention, makes us want to do something about it. But the other dimensions of workers' lives are pretty much neglected. You can look around a lot of newsrooms and you don't even see a labor correspondent in the mix. There's always a business reporter, usually more than one. A labor reporter, usually not. So that, I think this particular issue in some ways really exposes some of the problems that we have in terms of journalism. We don't have enough reporters who know enough about labor to bring that issue to us in a full way. If we did have more reporters of that kind, we probably would have had stories before Rana Plaza about the problems that were facing workers in that particular industry, the unsafe conditions under which they operate, the low wage conditions under which they operate. And basically, we might have had some, at an earlier time, we might have had more momentum toward doing something about this problem.
Thank you. We have a question from a student in the Boston area that ties in very well with what you just said. And that is, why do you think that, there's news that is, like you said, the business gets a lot of coverage, but that is not in the interest of the average citizen. And how come that there is this imbalance between news that is in the interest of the average citizen versus news that, like the Twitter IPO, that has just no relation to anyone, to the average citizen's life?
Well, I think journalists are probably like the rest of us. To some degree, they cover the things that interest them, and then they do the things that they're accustomed to doing. So, for example, if you look at Washington, you can go to the White House any day of the week, and there will be several hundred journalists in the vicinity. And if there's a presidential press conference, the room will be full. And sometimes the president won't even be in Washington. The president might be elsewhere. And there are days, even in the presidency, that are a bit slow. There may be nothing meaningful that's going on. But that's a tradition. And of course, for television journalists, it means standing outside the White House in the evening and doing a stand-up, talking about what happened inside as you're standing outside, as if that gave it more weight, gave it more authority. That, to me, is a kind of journalism that is unreflective. That's a kind of journalism that is simply built on routines. It's designed around beats. Well, we need our journalists who kind of look more broadly at the world, get out of Washington, get out of New York, and make the news more about ordinary people and our problems. News ought not to be just about politicians and their problems or corporate execs and their problems. Fundamentally, democracy is about people and their problems. We need more news of that kind. Journalists need to be trained to do that. They need to think in that broader lens about their reporting. Now that takes time. You have to undo a lot of practices, a lot of traditions that are deeply embedded in the news process to do that. But I think it's doable over time.
Do you know of any media outlets that are sort of going in that direction of broadcasting and making available news that is explicitly framed in the interest of the average citizen?
Well, I think there are some news outlets that do more of it than others. I think, for example, if you were to compare broadcasting outlets, I think you would find that National Public Radio, NPR, does more stories about ordinary people and what they're doing, what their lives are like, what their problems are, what their successes are, the opportunities that they face, the challenges that they face. I think NPR has a lot more of that than the other networks. So, I think it is doing. It still has a lot of. It's still a little bit top heavy. It's still kind of centered around the power centers. That's the tradition in American journalism. But there's a good model there that you can also cover ordinary people while at the same time you're covering the powerful.
Mm-hmm. One of the ideas or practices that has been gaining a lot of traction in the last years is the idea of crowdfunding. Do you think there might be a future for a media platform that sort of comes from the bottom up, from a large public interest in funding a platform that is geared towards informing news that is in their interest and that is relevant to them?
Well, I think sadly, those models don't work in the long run. They can work in the short run, but they tend not to work in the long run. The most successful case that we have, of course, is again National Public Radio. But if you look at the National Public Radio audience, the NPR audience, it's a quite large audience, somewhat on the order of 25 million listeners a week. Now, how many of those listeners contribute to National Public Radio? How many are willing essentially to part with their money for the news that they get from NPR? Well, it's about 10%. In other words, the other 90% are free riding. They're using the service, but they're not paying for it. The way that we ordinarily pay for news in America is indirectly. We have to sit through the advertising in order to get through the news. Now that model works. That's a time-tested model. I think the other models, voluntary contributions, expecting foundations somehow to come through. Foundations will fund interesting media ventures. They'll fund important possibilities, but they're not going to fund them indefinitely. So they might do a startup and give it the money to go for the first 2 or 3 years if it's trying to do news in a new and interesting and important way. But it's not going to guarantee that organization is going to get funding year after year. The places where you do have public funding of media are those places where basically it's a tax on the citizen. So, the BBC, how does it get most of its money? Well, it gets most of its money because you can't have a television set in Britain, without paying the fee that goes to the BBC. So, but that every television set owner has to pay that. That's different than a voluntary model, and sadly, I don't think there's a long future in the voluntary model of funding news.
Thank you. And so you just mentioned the BBC. Have you looked at international other countries' systems and have you found some differences with the U.S. Or some ideas like you just mentioned with the BBC that gets a lot of public funding that might be able to be introduced to the United States or reintroduced?
Well, there's certainly a lot of different ways of doing news, and if you look across the world, every news system has some special features, but there are some commonalities. By and large, the news is about current events, unless you're in a one-party state where the government controls what you see. But if there's a degree of freedom in the news system, the news is mostly about what's happening today and what happened yesterday. So that's a common feature. But then across news systems, you do see some differences, and they come out of different traditions. So in the American tradition, the news has been fundamentally commercial, supported by advertising. In some of the European systems, you have a deeper tradition of public news through public broadcasting. That makes a difference. If you're trying to meet the demands of a commercial market, you produce the product somewhat differently than if basically you're in the public information business and you don't have to worry so much about attracting audiences in a competitive environment. And then you find differences in traditions. So the American tradition of observation, of interviewing, that journalism tradition that I talked about in my opening comments, the interviewing tradition started in the United States. It was invented here. Now it's used also in Europe, but it's used less extensively. And in a country like Germany, there's much more of a tradition for journalists to kind of dig more deeply into the story, to apply knowledge to the story, not to the depth that I'm talking about in terms of changing journalism in a fundamental way, but that's a deeper part of the news there. You look at Sweden, they do it differently. They in some ways kind of have a social mission around their news in terms of getting to the various groups in society and have them represented in the news. And then in the British system, in addition to the BBC, you find some of the best newspapers in the world and then some of the worst ones. I mean, they have both a very high quality press and a very down market or tabloid press. So there's a lot of variation from places to places. I think every news system can learn some lessons from every other news system. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the training of the reporters and the resources that the reporters are given to go after the stories and to tell them fully and accurately.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about foundations that they're willing to fund new media ventures often. So Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, recently just announced that he would invest $250 million to launch a for-profit media venture with Glenn Greenwald. How do you see this model sort of launched by philanthropy, where one person with an incredible amount of economic power decides to launch a new media outlet?
Well, I think there are going to be more of these. You might even put Al Jazeera in that category. You probably could now put the Washington Post in that category. It was purchased recently by someone of extraordinary wealth. But in the United States, we've got 1,500, 1,600 daily newspapers. We've got that number of local television affiliates. And the very rich are not going to bail out all of those. I think what you'll see is the very rich looking for opportunities. The Washington Post is an important brand, and brand is important in the news industry. Second to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, it probably is the top newspaper brand in the United States. That can be attractive to someone who's very wealthy.